All right, it's time to get started. Welcome, everyone. My name's Ian Scarrett. I'm the head of marketing at CarbonCloud, and welcome to our May webinar. Unfortunately, my camera's not working very well today, so I can't turn it on, but I'm not the main speaker here. Emma Jonson's our main speaker, and she's going to talk to us about the science of calculating farm gate carbon emissions. Emma, could you go to the next slide, please, for me?
Yes. Oh, wait. Yes.
Before we get going, just a couple of housekeeping. This session is going to be recorded. We will send you a link to the recording in the slides after the webinar. It usually takes us one or 2 days to process the recording. We will have a Q&A at the end, and that will to submit your questions. Please put the questions in the Q&A chat pod at Q&A pod at the bottom of the screen. That allows us to kind of find the questions very easily and being able to ask them at the end. Okay. So next slide, please, Emma. So just quick introduction to Emma. Emma is one of our scientists here at CarbonCloud. CarbonCloud has a science team that really understands the deep details of doing carbon emissions. And we're very lucky to have Emma here. Emma's got a PhD from Chalmers University, which is really kind of the starting point of CarbonCloud. And one of the research groups from Chalmers kind of was at the genesis of CarbonCloud. So welcome, Emma, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ian, and thank you for all participants that have come here. I've seen that there are participants from many different types of organizations and types of companies, so it's great to have you all here. So diving into it, I would like to start with this figure representing the greenhouse gas concentration or the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And the figure here represents the 3 main anthropogenic greenhouse gases. That means the greenhouse gases that are related to human activity. So first of all, we have carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide is, of course, it bears the main responsibility for the global warming that we have already seen, and that is yet to happen. But we also have methane and nitrous oxide. Carbon dioxide originates mostly from the combustion of fossil fuels, but also from land use change. For example, when forest is converted to cropland, and some other sources. Then we have methane and nitrous oxide. Methane, a lot of it comes from the digestive tracts of ruminants, so the production of livestock. There are also some industrial sources relating to fuel production and other industries. And nitrous oxide, which is also very much related to agriculture, as well as different type of high temperature combustion processes. So what is interesting here is that these gases have had a quite stable concentration in the atmosphere for quite a long time. This figure represents 2,000 years, but you can go further back than so. And during a quite short period of time, the concentration has increased in all 3 of these gases. And as I said, the 3 gases are the main greenhouse gases also related to agriculture that we will see later in the presentation. So the concentration has been increasing, and the reason for that is that the emissions from human activities are increasing. This figure represents the yearly emissions of greenhouse gases. And now we're going to focus mostly on food. That is the topic of the seminar. And we can see that food is a quite big part of the total emissions. Of course, it is the combustion of fossil fuels that bears the largest responsibility for global warming, but food also plays a big role in this process. So this figure gives a little breakdown of the different components of emissions in the food production sector. starting in the bottom, the brown parts that are called land use here in the figure, we call that land use change. That comes from when one type of land use is converted to another. So it's typically forest that is converted to agricultural land. And it also includes what is called here cultivated organic soils, which is in fact drained wetlands, which appears in many countries. So a certain portion of crop production happens on drained wetlands. So that generate quite a bit of CO2 emissions. Then going upwards, the green part, crop production, that is what we would call emissions from land management relating to crop production. I will talk more about that in a little bit. So those are emissions originating from the farming itself. And then moving up, livestock and fish farms. That includes the emissions of methane that I talked before. That is quite important for the production of beef and dairy and other type of animal products, especially with ruminants. And then moving up, the last blue part represents the later part of the supply chain. So food processing, transport, packaging, and retail. And it's interesting to note that these parts are not a very big share of the total impact of food production. And granted, for specific, there are specific food products when these components are important, where they constitute a big share of the product footprint, packaging, for instance, or transport or food processing. But on the general level, on the global scale, those parts are not the biggest part of the climate impacts from the food sector. Yes, so what happens now? So we have global warming happening. There is more to come. The world has agreed to take action. This has been formulated in different ways. One common ambition that has been put forward both by countries and groups of countries is the net zero ambition for 2050. And the exact interpretation can be a little bit different. Sometimes it refers mainly to the CO2 part, the fossil CO2 part. In other cases it includes also the other greenhouse gases from agriculture. But regardless, the details, the path is hopefully downwards. That is the ambition. So reducing emissions is the goal for many countries. What does this mean for the food industry? Well, first of all, we have regulations coming. Here in the EU, we have a lot of talk about the CSRD, the Directive on Corporate Sustainability Reporting. And a big part of that is the reporting of greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, this is not only applicable to food companies, it is applicable to all companies. But for food companies, it can be specifically hard because food companies tend to have a very large share of the value chain emissions coming from scope 3, so outside the own operations of the company. And it's the same for US. It's also similar type of regulation that is coming. In EU, the first batch of companies that need to report is for next year, 2025, but eventually more and more companies will be included and will need to report under this directive. Then we also have voluntary frameworks like the science-based targets that we have several customers and other parties that we're talking to that are involved in. So it's a voluntary platform where you commit to reducing your emissions by pledging a target. And what is interesting here for the food industry is that the SBTI, the Science Based Target Initiative, they have recently defined a list of specific sectors that have to make separate and specific targets for that particular sector. So one of these sector is this thing called FLAG, forestry, land, and agriculture. So that means that if you are in an industry where a large share of your emissions come from agriculture, that means that you need to track and set targets for that specific part of your value chain, and you can't combine the targets to the non-flag part of your value chain. So you need to have specific tracking and reduction of that particular part of your value chain. So that, of course, makes it more interesting to have full and wide knowledge of that part of your value chain, so have better knowledge of the details of the agriculture part of your value chain. But what we have seen is that this is also causing a lot of questions and concerns sometimes because it is quite complex. It can be hard sometimes to keep track of what data to collect, how to integrate it to your calculations. And we agree that it is a bit complicated, but we also believe that we got you back if you choose to come with us. And we believe that there are tools that can be used to simplify this process. But why is calculating farm gate emissions complicated? Let's dive into it. Well, this figure represents the production of wheat in Sweden, and it comes from our platform, the Climate Hub. And here we show the breakdown of the different components that contribute to the total footprint of this farm gate product. So a complicated part is, of course, that there are many components to keep track of and to combine. So there are, in this figure, the fertilizer production, mechanisms that cause emissions of nitrous oxide, also the farming on drained wetlands that I talked about before, and then the production of other input to the farming, and machinery and drying. Those are the most important parts. Another complicated part is getting access, or it can be complicated. In many cases, it is a bit complicated, getting access to activity data. So activity data, that is the data describing what happens on the farm. How much fertilizer do you put on your soil? How much do you drive your tractor? How much electricity do you use? How much pesticides do you use? So those are the activity data that then is multiplied with an emission factor. So if you're a farmer, then you probably have quite good knowledge of your activity data. You probably know how much fertilizer you use and what type of fertilizer. And that means that you can calculate the emissions from your specific farm. What happens if you're a food manufacturer? You have probably some knowledge about your value chain. You probably know more or less what goes into the products that you produce. You probably know maybe what country it comes from, but you might not know how much pesticides were used when you produced when your ingredient was produced, for instance. So in that case, it can be difficult to know what activity data to use, and we will talk more about that later on. Now I would like to talk about the agricultural categories. This is the terminology used by the Greenhouse Protocol. So that the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is the overarching guide. They produce the guidelines that more or less are used by all the other directives and frameworks for accounting for your greenhouse gas emissions. So we have land management. What happens during your agricultural practices on the piece of land that you have? I'm talking now mainly about crop production to keep it simple. And we have land use change, which happens when one type of land use is converted to another type of land use, for instance, forestry to cropland. And then we have removals, which you could see as basically the opposite of emissions. So it's carbon taken from the atmosphere and absorbed in soil, for instance. Let's dive into these three different, starting with land management. This figure represents the main components of emissions from land management. So we have the enteric fermentation that I already mentioned, the methane that is produced from the digestive tracts of ruminants, and the manure management, which emits both nitrous oxide and methane. We have nitrous oxide emissions from soils, and it happens both directly and indirectly. Directly means that nitrogen that you apply to the soil is partly converted to nitrous oxide, but there's also some nitrogen that disappears from your soil in leaching and runoff, and then is partly converted to nitrous oxide, and that is also included in the footprint. There is some CO2 that can be emitted from biomass of different types. And farm machinery can also be an important part of the land management emissions. Yes, and I can mention also that rice cultivation is also an important source of methane emissions. So if you have an anaerobic environment, oxygen-free environment, that triggers the emissions or the production of methane. Let's look a little bit deeper into the generation and emission of nitrous oxide. This is the most, or the more complicated part, I would say, of the farm gate footprint. So as you probably know, nitrogen is a limiting factor to crop growth. That means that there is in many cases a lack of nitrogen, and if you give the plant more nitrogen, it will grow more. And nitrogen is an important part of amino acids and other structures in the plant. So it's a vital and important part of plant growth and plant production. But then you might ask, why do we need to give the plants nitrogen? There's so much nitrogen available in the air. Most of the air that we breathe is in fact nitrogen, as we have learned in school. The answer is that nitrogen in the atmosphere is in the form of nitrogen molecules, which is a very stable form of nitrogen. So it's very hard to separate one nitrogen atom to integrate it to the plant. So in reality, it's not available to the plant, even if there is a bunch of nitrogen around us, it's not available to the plant. So what they need is what we call reactive nitrogen. And as we see in this figure, it's in the form of either ammonium or nitrate. And in order to make those ions available to the plants, you need to supply nitrogen in the form of some type of fertilizer where these reactive forms of nitrogen is available. So what happens is that the nitrogen is applied to the soil in a sort of unstable state. Part of it is absorbed by the plant. Part of it leaves the field in the form of leaching or runoff. But part of it is absorbed or emitted back to the air, but it's not all of it directly converted back to nitrogen gas. Some of it takes a detour through nitrous oxide, and that is a very strong greenhouse gas. So in reality, it's almost impossible to have agriculture without any emissions of nitrous oxide. It will, in one way or another, it will most certainly happen a little bit, but by choosing how you fertilize, you can reduce emissions from nitrous oxide. So that was land management. Let's move on to land use change. What is land use change? Well, according to the Greenhouse Protocol, the definition is biogenic CO2 emissions resulting from carbon stock losses and other greenhouse gas emissions due to land use change. Those are the emissions that we want to measure. So what do we mean by that? A carbon stock loss, that means if we start with the carbon stock, so if you have a forest, or even better, a natural forest, the forest has a large carbon stock, and that means that the soil and the trees and other plants in the forest contain a lot of carbon. So if you convert the forest to cropland, most of that carbon in that carbon stock is lost and ultimately emitted to the atmosphere. So that is what we mean by a carbon stock loss. And then it says other greenhouse gas emissions due to land use change. So there we could include also nitrous oxide, for instance, that is emitted from drained wetlands, where we also have some farming. And if we look back on this figure that we saw before, we can see that it is quite a big part of the total footprint of agriculture. So why is it complicated to assess the footprint from land use change and attribute it to specific crops? Well, it A big problem is that in many cases, we don't have the exact knowledge of where exactly the crops in my value chain come from. And specifically, if you want to create footprints on a general level. So if you want to assess the footprint of a specific crop from one country, the general average footprint. So you may have knowledge of what deforestation has happened over the last 20 years. You probably also have knowledge of what crops were produced in that country over the same period of years. But how do you attribute the deforestation to the different crops that were produced? CarbonCloud uses an approach called the product expansion approach, which attributes deforestation to the crops that increased its production over that same period of years. And in order to do it, we have a specific model that does this attribution. Moving on to removals, the third category here. So what is removals? This is once again the description from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. They describe removals as the net increase to storage in land carbon pools due to ongoing management practices. So let's break it down. What is a carbon pool? A carbon pool, in this context, is a place where there is carbon. An example of a carbon pool is the atmosphere. The atmosphere is a carbon pool. Another carbon pool is the soil, and a third carbon pool is biomass. So if the carbon pool in the atmosphere decreases and the carbon pool in the soil increases, then you have removals. So removals of carbon from the atmosphere to the soil or to biomass. So the problem with, or the difficulty when accounting for removals is that there are quite high requirements if you want to claim removals in your value chain. So first of all, I can mention also that removals, accounting for removals is voluntary. So it's always mostly conservative to say that you don't have any removals. And if you want to claim removals, then you need to have quite substantial evidence to prove it. So what you need, according to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, is that you need to have ongoing storage monitoring. So that often means physical measurements of the exact piece of land where the crops were produced. So it's not enough to just have some statistical figures of what might happen or what sometimes happen. You need to have monitoring on that specific plot of land. Second of all, you need to have traceability through the full CO2 removal pathway, all the way to the plot of land where the carbon is stored. So what does that mean? So if you are a retailer and you have a product that contains wheat, let's say, and if you wanna claim removals in your value chain, you need to have traceability all the way back to the specific piece of land where that exact wheat was grown. And then you need also the monitoring of that piece of land. And third of all, the reversals accounting. What does that mean? That means that even if you did have monitoring and you did have the traceability, you need to continue the monitoring year after year. So if you have that plot of land in your value chain, you need to every year continue the monitoring and make sure that the carbon that was removed stays in the soil, that it's not re-emitted. And if you no longer have that plot of land in your value chain, maybe you sold that piece of land, or you don't source your ingredients from that plot of land anymore, then you need to report reversals. So basically, you need to conservatively assume that the carbon that was stored is then re-emitted to the atmosphere. So for that reason, we on a general level, we do not assume removals unless we have these specific conditions met. So down to the details, how to calculate. Well, I've already talked about the activity data part. This list here, I think that represents the Swedish wheat that we saw before. So these are the activity data that we assumed here in CarbonCloud for our calculation of the Swedish wheat. And on a general note, activity data can represent either a specific farm or a generic production. So if you have a specific farm, if you have a farm and you know your what activities you have there, then you can input those numbers into the equations. But on the other hand, if you just know that you have wheat from Sweden, how then will you get these generic production data? Well, I will tell you all about it. So the first way that one could do is that if you have maybe a specific LCA study from one specific farm, you could take the activity data from that specific farm, and then you can somehow either use it directly and assume that it represents the general production of that country, or in somehow extrapolate if you have a few data points. So based on one or a few data points, produce an activity data that you hope is representative for the generic production. And the other version is the statistical model that, or a more statistical approach that we use in CarbonCloud when we estimate the activity data for generic production. So you could describe this more as a top-down approach. So you would in general use a data set that could be national statistics or other types of data set that represents the general use of fertilizer, for instance, if we take that example, and then you try to formulate some relation between the statistical data and the production, and then you create a data set of activity data that represents different crops in different countries. So basically, you want to make sure that it all fits together so that the sum of the parts equals the total. And with this method, you can, of course, always compare it to individual LCA studies. That is generally quite insightful. Then sometimes you can see that it matches quite well. In other cases, you might see that there's a big difference from these individual footprints. And then you can, in some cases, find a reason for it. It might be that the specific study had a specific represented a very specific type of production. It could be some organic production under specific circumstances. Also, in many cases, the LCA studies, the goal of the LCA studies for specific farms is often to investigate, and it's some sort of research of special conditions. So it's not really representative for production in general. So for that reason, it is more safe to use a statistical model. Then we get to the emission factor part. So you had the activity data, you multiply it with an emission factor, and then you get your footprint. So how do you get your emission factors? Well, you can use different types of sources. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, they provide some emission factors. For instance, emission factors representing the production of nitrous oxide from nitrogen inputs to the soil. In other cases, you could also use, you can go directly to the source. So IPCC, what they do, they gather and collect the whole range of scientific knowledge and compile that. So, but you can of course also go directly to the source of this in the scientific literature. You could use commercial databases. You can, in some cases, use governmental agencies that might supply emission factors for electricity, for instance, and other activities. You can, in some cases, use industry groups that provide emission factors for different types of input, for instance. So in CarbonCloud, we use, I would say, all of these except commercial databases. So we instead produce our own database and use and try to use as much as possible scientific literature as the source of our emission factors. So why is farm gate footprints important? Well, we mentioned in the beginning the CSRD, the European directive that will require both reporting of climate emissions, but also strategies and targets for reduction. And for food companies or companies in the food industry, farm gate emissions is, of course, a very big part of the value chain emissions. So for that reason, it's interesting to have knowledge and on a more detailed level, so that it also provides input for ideas on how to actually formulate your reduction strategies and targets. And I also mentioned before the science-based target that now has these separate flag requirements, meaning that the agricultural part of your value chain needs to have specific targets or separate targets that you can't combine with the non-flag targets. So you need to have reduction in your agricultural part of your value chain. Yes. Then, of course, it is also the customer demand aspect of things. So retailers and wholesalers will require emission data from suppliers. And since this is very much a value chain question, and supplier engagement is becoming more and more important for these assessments. And well, I would say you can do the assessment without supplier engagement. You can use whatever data you do have on your production, but if you also have supplier engagement, that can, of course, increase the level of detail. So you can use different levels in your assessment. And then we have also seen that there is a customer demand for sustainable ingredients. So we have examples of customers that have used product footprints as a part of their marketing strategy in a successful way. So how can CarbonCloud help? Well, let me introduce CarbonCloud. We are a vibrant startup based here in Sweden. We are founded by climate scientists and focus on carbon data. We have a large database of more than 53,000 products. And these products, it's both farm gate products and processed ingredients that we provide generic footprints for. And we have a climate intelligence platform for the food industry. And you can see here a little collection of some of the brands and retailers that we work with. About CarbonCloud data, we provide the most comprehensive agricultural data for food on the generic level, where we supply footprints for 16,000 crops from 93 countries. And it's with the help of these statistical models that I talked about that makes it possible for us to provide this amount of footprints. Yes, so as I mentioned, all data built using statistical model, so that makes it easy to compare and update your footprint based on any change in production. We also provide a farm gate tool. So if you do have access to the specific activity data from a specific farm, then you are also able to calculate the specific footprints from that farm. And we can quickly generate value chain climate emission data points that are compliant with Greenhouse Gas Protocol and CSRD and SBTI. So I think I finished 2 minutes ahead of time.
Well done, Emma. Well done. So, and again, I apologize. My camera's not working very well, so I'm not going to turn it on. But why don't you, get a drink? It's a long ways to go without a pause. So, but thank you very much for the presentation. We've got lots of questions from the audience, so we'll go through that. Just a reminder, if you do have a question, please put it into the Q&A chat pod at the bottom of the screen. So the first question is, and you kind of just alluded to this at the end, but how do you know that the way you calculate your emissions are valid for SBTI and CSRD?
That they are what?
So how do you know that the way you calculate your emissions are valid for SBTI and CSRD?
Well, both of these frameworks, first of all, they refer to, or specifically SBTI, they refer to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol as the guide for how to calculate emissions. The CSRD is a little bit more flexible, I would say, but it is always safest to calculate according to the Greenhouse Protocol, because that is the mother framework, I would say, that most other regulations reply to, that they refer to, if they refer to anything at all. So SBTI, yeah, so I that is my answer. SBTI.
I think you're right. I think it's the Greenhouse Gas Protocol that we're following. That's really our guide on how to do the emissions calculation.
Explicitly demanded by.
For sure. Basically, if you're not using that, then you should be questioning whether the results are valid, right? So, so which tool do you use to calculate your PCFs? An example is Excel. Which database emissions factors do you use? And I think you alluded to this in your presentation, but
the product footprint. So we don't use any external commercial database at all. We generate all footprints in-house. And as I mentioned, we do use emission factors that we get from other places, not commercial databases though, but we do use we use recommended and well established and well well known
Yeah.
sources for emission.
Well, and just relating back to your presentation, I think kind of at the heart of CarbonCloud is the statistical models that you and the science team have created to generate all this database of emission factors. And in my mind, I think the important reason for doing that is so you can start to compare emission factors, right? Because in the kind of with CSRD, you're going to have to start to reduce your emission factors. And so to do that, you can actually look at different areas where you could source wheat, for instance, right? And because we're kind of it's the wheat kind of emission factor by country is calculated the same way, then you're doing a valid comparison in terms of what's the lowest kind of country for emission factors for wheat, for example. So I think that's kind of at the heart of CarbonCloud is using these models for doing that. Would
Yeah,
you agree?
exactly. So if you have in other if you don't have that type of statistical models, you might instead look at individual studies, as I mentioned, from specific farms in different countries. But then it's hard to know if the one is lower than the other. It's hard to know if that is representative for the country or if that just happens to be some specific conditions on those specific farms. So,
Right.
um,
And the other thing is that when you start to take in primary data, which in the future more and more primary data is going to come in for calculating emissions, at CarbonCloud, you can actually input primary data at the farm level, but you're using the same models. You're inputting the activity data for that farm, but the calculations are done in a consistent fashion too. So
yeah.
again, it's being able to compare. Why don't we go on to the next one? Can an annual crop claim for removals? I'm not sure if I understand that question, but
If an annual crop
crop,
can claim removals,
yeah,
in principle, yes. You can do it. I think I don't have on the top of my mind how long the monitoring will have to go on. I'm sorry that I am not 100% able to give the details, but I think that the monitoring that is required that needs to happen over quite a long period of time. So
right,
it's not just monitoring that can happen over a year, for instance, if you want to claim, for instance, soil carbon sequestration. It would have to happen over a longer. I'm
yeah.
fairly certain.
Well, and I think I remember kind of asking you this kind of before the webinar, and I think in general we find people actually it's really really cumbersome to track removals, so people aren't doing removals that often. Would you agree with that? Okay.
Yeah. I mean, yes, since it is quite hard, but of course, in principle, it is possible. There are different scientific discussions on different types of farming practices that may or may not, for instance, increase soil carbon. It could be tilling or using, different crops in combination with the main crop, for instance. It could be different practices that have been claimed to maybe increase soil carbon. So if you do have one of those specific practices and you do have monitoring over the years to see if there is a continuous increase of carbon in the soil, then it would be possible to claim removals. Yes.
Okay. Great. Let's go on to the next one. So I wonder, would you know how secure deforestation-free sourcing can be accounted in GHG reporting? For example, assuming we have 95% verified deforestation-free sourcing operations, in what category is this falling under? Avoidances?
No, if you have deforestation-free production, then it's just that you don't have any land use change emissions. So it's not that you get negative emissions. It's just that your level of emissions is lower than the default if you have no deforestation related to your production.
Okay. It's just a general question. I'm not sure if you can. So, how do you avoid double counting? I guess I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yes, so I think it relates to the last question. So you don't account for avoided emissions. You just account for the emissions that you actually have. So if you, for instance, have a default where you do have some deforestation, for instance, on a general level of crops from a specific country, but then you have uh, good knowledge and good evidence to prove your value chain where your crop comes from, and that it happens to be so that you don't have any deforestation attributable to your specific crop. That just means that you don't you yeah, so you don't get a minus for avoided emissions. You just count the actual emissions. So if there are emissions that don't happen, that just means that you don't account for them. I think that is the
Okay.
but
Okay.
there are other aspects of double counting when it comes to electricity, for instance. That's a separate story.
Yeah.
Let me know if I should go into that.
Okay. So you can, the person that asked that question, you can ask a follow-up question, and if we have time, we'll get to it. If not, we can kind of schedule a call to follow up with you in person. So the next question, what is recommended for retailers to account their flag emissions, including ultra-processed food, when no ingredient data is not when ingredient data is not available?
If you're a retailer and you are selling processed food and ingredient data is not known, um, I would say, I mean, we do have in CarbonCloud we have different granularity of footprints, I would say. So we have everything from farm specific footprints, generic footprints on crop level, but then we also have footprints on category level. So if you're a retailer and you don't have specific knowledge of the ingredients that have gone into one of your processed products, then we would attribute it to one of our food categories, and then we would provide a generic, uh, probably a little bit more conservative footprint that would include part of that would include assumptions about
Right.
ingredients and
I think this is very common for retailers where they have a huge catalog of products that they over time they're going to need to get from their supply their scope 3 primary data from them, but they need to get going, right? And I think one of the keys with CarbonCloud is we can actually we have modeling technology that can model a product category from a retailer into our categories and the data, right? So you can get an estimate. It's a starting point for the carbon emission for like an ultra processed food. Over time, the regulations will require you to get to that supplier and to get their primary data, their primary ingredient data. CarbonCloud has the ability to kind of take in that data directly into the platform. But this is a common challenge we find with our retailer customers is and this is why our category data is also very important
yeah,
for that.
and that I think that relates also to the general guidelines of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, because it is as you said a common issue that when you're starting out with these assessments you might not have very detailed knowledge, so you start out with whatever data you do have, and then over the years you dig deeper into the data of your production, and then you get higher and higher quality assessments. But it is part of the subscribed or the prescribed way of doing it from the greenhouse gas protocol, that you start out on a basic level, on a more non-granular level, and then you dig deeper over the years when you have more and more knowledge, but you might not have perfect knowledge from the beginning.
And I think that's very represented in the way the regulations are being rolled out too. Like they acknowledge that the precision of the data is not there yet, but over time, kind of the industry needs to get more precise.
Yeah.
So next question, and I'll give you a break. I'll take this one because I know the answer to this one. So are your PCFs for the products or your approach also externally verified? And kind of we are going through an external audit by one of the major accounting firms, global accounting firms. It's a bit early to kind of announce kind of who, and the results is going to be yes, we're externally verified. But yes, we have taken a third party and given them access to our process, and it will be externally verified. Do you have anything to add to that, Emma? Or?
No, good
okay.
answer.
Okay. So this is another question about the removal. So for how many years do you need to monitor your removals when you use them to compensate for emissions? Do you know that off the top of your head?
Unfortunately, I don't have that on the top of my head. I know that you need to have it over several years. Unfortunately, I can't answer that specific question of exactly how many years.
I would like to know if the emissions from pesticide applications need to be reported. As you said before, emissions from fertilizers applications, synthetic nitrogen, need to be reported. But what about pesticides? Are the emission factors available?
Yeah. I mean, normally it should be part of the farm gate footprint, well, I can say you need to include it in one way or another. The way I think most do it, and we in CarbonCloud also do it, is that we include it in the farm gate footprints. But if you don't include it there, then you need to include it in the non-flag part of your targets, so to say, if you're working with the SBTI, for instance. So you need to include it in one way or the other, and I would recommend including it in the flag part of your inventory.
Okay, so we'll take two more questions. So how do you estimate deforestation data?
Yeah, good question. We are working together with a research group at Chalmers, the university that Ian, mentioned in the beginning of the presentation. So many of us working here at CarbonCloud, we have a background at Chalmers. We have a very good relationship together with a research group that is conducting state-of-the-art, I would say, research on deforestation. They are mentioned. I can brag a little bit. They are mentioned in the European No Deforestation Directive. It's the only scientific reference I have found in that directive that refers to Pendrell and Passion, and they have done a very thorough investigation of deforestation related and attributing deforestation to crop production. That is their scientific contribution. So the method that the process that I described before, it's based on, or it's done by these researchers. And since we have a close relation, we also get availability to the raw data, so we can also check it, and we can manipulate it if it's needed, or if there's any change in regulation, for instance, the No Deforestation Directive that I mentioned looks at deforestation that happens after 2020. So we can, with this raw data, we are also able to assess deforestation in that time frame, not only the 20 years. So yes, the question was, how do we attribute deforestation to specific crops? I think I mentioned it a little bit before. So it is also a statistical model, you can say, that takes deforestation that has happened over a certain time period, 20 years, in a country, And then you investigate how the expansion of different crops have taken place in that country, and then you allocate or attribute the deforestation in proportion to the expansion of those crops in that country.
Okay. So let's try and we'll do this one last one because I said two more, but we're a bit over time. But how to connect all your food raw materials to your CO2 factors, looking at one for one. So my guess is this is have you got a product in the ingredient list would be
I didn't get the question. Could you repeat?
Yeah, you know what? So I know that I read it again. So I think the question is they've got a manufactured product. They've got kind of a long list of raw materials that go into it. How do you kind of calculate it by that? And the answer is that to do a calculation of PCF with raw materials, you input the ingredient list, basically the bill of materials for that product, the quantities, the location of the source location of the raw materials, and then we can use that information to calculate the PCF of a manufactured product. So yes, I think that was.
Yeah. So if you have the bill of material, that is the best. Sometimes you don't have that. You only have the contents of the product. So you might know that
Okay.
product consists of 80% to this and 20% that. But to produce that product, it might have needed 5 kilos of something to produce 1 kilo of the product. So then you would also need to take into account. So for that reason, it's always better if you have the actual bill of material. If you don't have it, then we have other methods to estimate it.
All right. So Emma, thank you very much. It was very insightful. I've learned a lot, and this is where I wanted to have this webinar so I could kind of learn the nitty-gritty details of the science behind carbon reporting. So thank you. Thank you for the audience for attending. Some great questions. There's a survey that you'll be presented. Please give us your feedback on the webinar. It helps us improve webinars into the future. We didn't get to all the questions. If you'd like to follow up with us, send us an email at hello@carboncloud.com. We'd be happy to help you with any questions that you have. Okay. So thank you, everyone, and thank you, Emma. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.